Brian Ortega dislocated his shoulder against Yair Rodriguez, putting an unfortunate ending to what was otherwise supposed to be a pretty high-level fight. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and in this video I'm going to teach you exactly what happened here with Brian Ortega's right shoulder in his fight against Yair Rodriguez. As Ortega's fighting to get out of this position, he suffers a right anterior, meaning forward, shoulder dislocation, meaning a dislocation of the ball and socket joint of the shoulder. It's probably much earlier in this whole sequence where the shoulder actually dislocated when we finally see sort of that flattening or that deformation in the shoulder because of that ball and socket being dislocated. But here eventually, as Ortega comes up, you can kind of see this flattening of the contour of the outside of his shoulder. That's kind of flattening of that profile because the ball of his shoulder has popped forwards relative to the socket. With our biodigital anatomy tool here, I've highlighted the structures we need to worry about with the shoulder. Of course, the ball in the socket is going to be the glenohumeral joint. That's what we think of when we hear about a shoulder dislocation or a shoulder subluxation. When somebody talks about a shoulder separation, that specifically refers to this acromioclavicular joint, the AC joint that sits at the top of the shoulder. So shoulder dislocation, ball and socket, shoulder separation, higher up. Here we're talking about the ball and the socket. Specifically with Ortega, it's an anterior dislocation because the ball moves forward relative to the socket, which is by far and away the most common types of dislocation we see. We'll dive into the mechanism and relate it to what we saw with Ortega, but first I want to give a quick shout out to the sponsor of this video. The average person can lose around 1 liter of sweat per hour of exercise, and when you lose that sweat, you're also losing electrolytes. The sponsor of today's video, Element, is an electrolyte drink mix that features all those important electrolytes that you need without any of the extra sugar or other ingredients that you don't. Quick science lesson. Nearly every physiologic process within our body relies on electrolytes for proper function, and so if we have alterations of those electrolyte levels, we can have a number of bad side effects, things like muscle cramping and fatigue, and so it's important to have optimal levels of electrolytes for your general health and for athletic performance. My go-to is Element, because you're getting a science-backed formulation of electrolytes with no added sugar or artificial sweeteners. Each serving contains 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. And you don't have to worry about feeling crummy afterwards from consuming a ton of sugar, like a lot of the sports drinks on the market. Element is offering my viewers a great deal right now. With any Element purchase, you're gonna get a free sample pack. That's 8 free individual packets of Element with any purchase. Get yours today at drinklmnt.com/BrianMD. The link is down in the description, so click it to take advantage of this offer that's only available through my link. So thank you again to Element for sponsoring today's video, and let's get back to our learning. Anterior shoulder dislocations typically occur whenever there's some sort of force that causes the head of that humerus or the arm bone to be directed forward. You essentially kind of lever the shoulder out of its joint. We see this a lot of times if somebody goes into what we call an extended position, so the shoulder kind of back behind them and then rotated outwards. That forces the ball of the shoulder forward, which makes these dislocations more likely. We've heard about Ortega having a previous labral injury in the shoulder, and that labrum is that little rim of cartilage that goes around the socket. And whenever the ball shears past that socket, it can tear the labrum. It's actually very, very common to have a labral injury whenever somebody dislocates their shoulder. The other thing that can happen is whenever the ball of the humerus goes forward, you can get a little impaction fracture here on the outside of the humerus when it bumps up against the bone of the socket. You can also injure your rotator cuff, the biceps, other things can be torn here, but typically we're thinking about the labrum and sort of the ball socket area whenever we see that dislocation. So now let's take this back to the sequence with Ortega. Remember, what we're looking for is that force driving the top of the humerus forward. And so here, Rodriguez's right thigh is positioned on the back of Ortega's humerus, pushing it forward as he holds onto the arm down below. And so what that's gonna do is not only distract, meaning pull the humerus forward relative to its socket, but it's also going to apply this lever where the humerus gets pushed anterior in the direction that it ultimately dislocates. As that sequence then continues, we see more. Rodriguez's right thigh comes further around. He's cranking that humerus forward, levering it forward out of the socket. So probably at least by this point, the shoulder's out of place. Rodriguez's right thigh has pushed that arm forward with the hand kind of bringing the distal end of it backwards. That levers the humeral head anterior, which leads to this dislocation, and ultimately where we can by now already see that loss of the contour in his shoulder because of that flattening where the ball is now forward. I'll also mention further back in this whole sequence, this arm was being stressed as well. Here we can see again that arm is in that little bit of extended position, a little bit externally rotated up here for Ortega, and so we're already in that susceptible position. As he comes down to the ground, it gets pulled even more as his body sort of starts to rotate here. And so even in this position, that's applying some force on the shoulder to make that ball socket want to pop forward. The next steps for Ortega are going to be, number one, making sure in fact that the shoulder has been reduced. It was hard to be 100% certain at the post-fight interviews if it was back in place. It looks like we've kind of lost that abnormal contour, so hopefully they did get it reduced. But number one, of course, get the shoulder back reduced. Then of course you need to do some imaging. In this case, you're gonna get an x-ray to help look at the bone, because sometimes when that ball shears forward, it can chip off a piece of the socket. And then an MRI scan to look and see what happened with the labrum. Look and see if anything from the previous surgery has been damaged, presence of rotator cuff tears, any of these additional injuries that could influence the ultimate treatment plan. Just because somebody dislocates their shoulder doesn't mean you have to have surgery. Oftentimes, the higher risk the sport, the more likely you might be to have a surgery, or the younger your age. And so certainly somebody like Ortega, who's young, very high risk sport, you might think a little bit more about doing a surgery, but all of the different factors at play in terms of the imaging findings, his symptoms, his sort of clinical exam are going to influence that decision. So he said he might need another surgery. That's all to be determined until we get more information. If this is managed without surgery, you're still likely looking at multiple months before he'd be at a high enough level to be able to grapple without any feeling of instability in the shoulder. Initially, you're going to immobilize the shoulder just for comfort, but then progressively start to work on range of motion to get that motion back in the shoulder, get the strength back, and then work on that dynamic stability with like your rotator cuff to help provide support to that ball and socket joint to prevent it from dislocating again. But that's it for the video, everybody. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later.